Are we approaching a point where it will become so easy to fake video and audio that those types of things, anything digital perhaps, will no longer be admissible in court?
Ultimately, then, your outlook on economic growth this year and in 2027.
Nobody loses their job to a new technology. You lose your job to somebody else who knows how to use that technology.
The U.S. is on track to leave USMCA. So is this the end of free trade in North America? What's going to happen to economic growth? What's going to happen to tariffs? Will we see a reprieve in inflation following what's happened with oil prices coming down? Will oil go back up? What will be the fate of our jobs once AI starts to take over on a broader scale? These are the questions and much more that we'll be exploring with E.J Antoni, Chief Economist at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to the show, E.J. Good to see you.
Well, David, thank you for having me. Pleasure is all mine.
Let's talk about the outlook for the economy itself. Now, just earlier today, we have this story that popped up, which we should talk about. U.S. declaration to exit USMCA. So the U.S. President Donald Trump, his administration is expected to formally declare on Wednesday, which is tomorrow, that it will not extend the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement on trade, starting a decade-long clock to unwind down the 32-year-old North American Free Trade Zone as the three countries haggle over proposed changes. That declaration will kick off a 6-year review session, part of a sunset clause. Do you think NAFTA is done?
Well, NAFTA was certainly done, right? But in terms of USMCA, I'm really hoping. Well, first of all, it's not done overnight. Yeah, as you just mentioned, this just starts a process of unwinding it, but it'll take years for that to happen. In fact, it wouldn't even take effect until Trump is long gone out of office. But
when I said NAFTA, I really meant free trade. I mean, the idea of free trade in North America is a block. Are we ever going to get that back?
I hope so. Part of this might just be warring personalities. Lighthizer was one of the big architects of USMCA. He's kind of been boxed out, it seems, from this administration, unfortunately, because I think he really was, in a lot of ways, the level head when it came to trade, as opposed to guys like Peter Navarro and Howard Lutnick, who I think this go around have been incredibly problematic and have made a lot of mistakes. At the end of the day, free trade has been incredibly good for the United States, but I think you can have free and fair trade. You can have reciprocity. Unfortunately, this administration's attempts to have reciprocity, well, it just hasn't gone well. We still don't have a truly reciprocal tariff schedule. Unfortunately, that's been incredibly problematic. The kind of slapdash way in which this administration is putting tariffs on certain things and not on others, and the rates are up, the rates are down. It has not worked very well. It's been incredibly problematic for markets. I really hope that this is mostly just a negotiating tool and a threat to try to get nations like Canada and Mexico, obviously in this case, to try to come to the table and to give us more favorable deals in terms of reducing the barriers that they put in place, whether those are tariff or non-tariff barriers. Again, to try to get them to open up more of their consumer markets to producers here in the United States. But we want more free trade, not less ultimately. And I really hope that the administration kind of course corrects here and fixes this.
Before we continue with the video, let's talk about a company that's building serious gold leverage for the long term. Our sponsor today, Stellar Gold, is sitting on 3 major Canadian projects. Tower and Colamac are among the largest undeveloped gold sites in the country. The Tower project alone could be worth $2.5 billion after tax at a $3,200 gold price assumption. And if prices go higher, so does its value. Colamac spans over 1,000 square kilometers of greenstone deposits and could be Canada's next big gold camp. They also have Hollinger Tailings, a cleanup project that could deliver near-term cash flow. Across all projects, they've drilled over 16 million ounces of gold, which would cost over $2 billion to replicate today. With a seasoned team, Stellar Gold is one company to watch. Scan the QR code here on screen or visit stellargold.com/David Lin to learn more. Do you think economic growth can continue even without free trade? Let's just evaluate the growth of the U.S. economy here. So last quarter, the economy grew at 2% real GDP. Do you think that tariffs, which you've criticized, can hold that back?
Well, certainly. I mean, look, at the end of the day, nobody really knows what directions the whole tariff discussion is going to go. It has been all over the place for more than a year now. And so you're kind of think of it as your confidence interval is going to be incredibly wide here, with on the very low end economic growth being negative, on the high end economic growth still being pretty decent, because we just don't know which direction these negotiations are going to go. We don't know what direction this administration is going to go, unfortunately. Again, we still to this day do not have a truly reciprocal tariff schedule, even though we were promised that. So until we get a better sense of direction here, I just think there's no way to tell. And if you're going to continue down this path of imposing tariffs that, and again, I'm not against tariffs entirely, but if you're going to continue imposing tariffs in the wrong way, I think you're going to continue to do some economic harm, which could ultimately really compound.
The current tariff situation has been compounded on top of the last one. And so we saw in the last couple of administrations, each subsequent administration has imposed more tariffs and more sanctions globally. I think, is this just a global trend where we're headed into protectionism despite or regardless of whichever administration is in power, the Democrats or the Republicans?
It's a really good question. Unfortunately, it does kind of feel that way. It feels like the 1930s all over again in that sense, where it was just beggar thy neighbor economics. All of these different countries kept putting tariffs on each other, and then they essentially were doing competitive devaluations of their currencies, and it continued to drive up consumer prices without actually making anybody better off, globally speaking. It really is unfortunate. Now, look, I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom here, right? We might be going in that direction, but it's at a pretty slow pace, if we're being honest about it, right? The total amount of tariffs that we have seen imposed over the last, whether it's this administration, the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, the total amount of tariffs relative to the size of the American economy is pretty small. Part of that is because in the U.S., the percentage of our economy that comes from international trade is one of the lowest in the country. If you look at most other nations, international trade is a much higher percentage of their overall economy. Here in the U.S., it's really not. In fact, most of the stuff that we import in this country, we actually export. We don't even consume here. Look at all the oil that comes in from the Canadian tar sands. A lot of that we simply refine and then send it right back up to Canada so that Canadians can put it in their gas tanks, right? So yes, it is moving in the wrong direction, I think, overall. But again, let's put it in context and realize that you're not moving at anywhere near the speed of the 1930s.
So ultimately, then, your outlook on economic growth this year in 2027?
Well, I would have given you a much more bullish outlook if you had asked me in February. But, unfortunately, the fallout from the Iran war is very, very real. It's significant. And a lot of it, I would say even the majority of it, hasn't even hit the economy yet. That's going to happen in the months to come. And again, you're going to continue to see these different components of consumer prices individually have their respective spikes as the weeks and months wear on. And again, all of that is baked to the cake. Let's say that the current truce or peace deal, whatever you want to call it, holds. Oil continues flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Spot prices stay where they are. The futures prices continue to have a 7 handle on them. Fine. You still have all those different prices baked into the cake. And so that's going to drag on economic growth. I don't think a 4 or a 5 handle for the year, which is what I was saying previously, but I don't think a 4 or a 5 handle for the year is likely at this point. I think probably you're looking at somewhere in the 2s. Might you get a 3 handle? It's possible, but probably a 2.
Let's talk about inflation itself, and then we'll come back to data centers and AI. Now, I want to talk about the data gathering of inflation. A lot of economists, not even just outside in the government, some economists on the show have voiced concerns about the accuracy of the data in terms of not the accuracy of the collection process, but how accurate it really reflects our everyday life at the grocery store, at the gas pump, and so on and so forth. Now, you were actually at one point nominated to lead the BLS following the firing of Erica McAntifer, and part of the controversy around her firing was that it was believed by the Trump administration that the BLS data was not accurate and somehow manipulated. So can you just comment on whether or not you believe that there should be an improvement in terms of the accuracy of the data gathering of the inflation data that we have by the government?
Oh, there certainly needs to be an improvement in the quality of the data coming out of BLS. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think there's actually pretty broad bipartisan consensus around that point. And, you can look to the fact that the revisions that we have seen recently are truly unprecedented, not only unprecedented in terms of their size, but in terms of the fact that they are consistently going in the same direction. We would expect statistically, we would expect these things to be kind of what we call a random walk, where you have 1 month up, 1 month down, and that pattern just kind of continues, and then it averages out to zero. If those revisions are not averaging out to zero or something very close, then it may indicate that you have a bias there. And I'm not talking about a political bias here or something nefarious. I'm talking about the word bias in the statistical sense, where your model essentially is going to be producing results that are, again, consistently in the wrong direction, but consistently the same wrong direction. So that's basically what we have when we look at things like the non-farm payroll numbers that we get every month from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And you see that in terms of the monthly revisions, but then also in terms of those annual, what is called the benchmark revision too. The same BLS, though, that does the jobs report also does the consumer price index and the PPI that we mentioned earlier. So that also has, let me put it this way, that report is also very, very problematic because a lot of changes have been made over the years to the consumer price index. And the problem is that they all bias it in the same direction, downward. Now, some of those changes, I think there was good reason for making them. But even if you look at things like the hedonic adjustment that tries to control for the quality of products and services improving over time, I think it's very, very clear that those things have been overestimated. In other words, it has artificially reduced the consumer price index, and that compounds pretty significantly over time. And it's one of the reasons why, if you look at real-time price aggregators like Truflation, for example, which looks at literally millions of prices every single day, whereas the BLS looks at a few thousand prices 3 times a month, Truflation for a good number of years there showed that prices were increasing much, much faster than the BLS had estimated. And I was actually able to have a very nice in-depth conversation with the new Fed chairman. This is back in August, I believe it was, of last year. We talked about problems with the way we gather and process data at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We talked about the need to really revise our entire, really the whole way we keep the national accounts. It's amazing how, David, the same way that we measured the economy over 100 years ago is basically what we do today, even though there have been massive changes moving from a manufacturing-centered economy to a service sector-based economy. We don't really accurately measure so much of work that's done in the home, for example. Think of it. If you have somebody in the home who is cooking and cleaning, that's not really captured in the way we measure the economy. But as soon as they outsource that to somebody else, now all of a sudden it is captured. And again, that may seem like a very, very small and not a very significant example. But that really, again, these things compound. And when you're talking about this happening for millions of people, and that's just one example, there are countless others, it really, I think, is time to revisit how we measure economic activity, how we measure prices, all of those things.
Is it in the best interest of the White House, though, to keep, and actually for the American people to actually have official inflation numbers, maybe a little bit lower than they actually are? Think about it. If they're actually as high as some people think they should be, the Fed will be raising rates already. Wouldn't that make monetary policy tighter and more difficult for businesses?
Well, it's, I think this is that old Keynesian trade-off, which I actually don't agree with, but it's this idea of, well, if we tolerate some inflation, then we can have these lower interest rates. Of course, you still have that inflation. It's essentially giving with one hand and taking away with the other. But it goes back to this idea of what is actually causing the inflation. I reject wholeheartedly, and Kevin Marsh does too, this Keynesian notion of a Phillips curve, that somehow too many people being employed and being gainfully employed and making money is somehow going to cause prices to rise. Look, Say's law is just as true today as it was when he authored it hundreds of years ago. The fact is, supply creates its own demand. More people working and more people producing means there are more products and services in the economy to soak up all of that excess liquidity, and it puts downward, not upward pressure on prices.
Here we have the Conference Board releasing their latest consumer confidence index. In June, it ticked up slightly by 0.6 points to 91.2. Here, there's an explanation. Consumer confidence inched up in June as falling oil prices in recent weeks provided some relief to consumer inflation fears. Can you comment on this? And do you agree that prices will remain low due to lower oil prices going forward, EJ?
Well, unfortunately, we're going to see kind of a repeat of what we saw in 2020 and 2021. By the way, you can tell with that, with the consumer confidence there, we've been in a downward trend for years now, albeit a bit erratic, but you get the spike when essentially the economy reopens. But then again, I think it's very clear we have been in a downward trend for a very long time, which speaks to broader ills within the economy. Getting back though to your question on prices, one of the things that we saw in COVID was by shutting down the economy, you created all kinds of supply chain disruptions and all kinds of shortages, but they took different amounts of time to actually rear their heads in terms of impacting the consumer. When did those price increases start showing up? There were things that were baked into the cake in April, May, June, July of 2020 that don't actually show up at the consumer price level until basically a year later, in the middle of 2021. We're going to see exactly the same thing this go around, because of the disruptions that have stemmed from the Strait of Hormuz being closed for so long, from the oil supply shock that we've had. And let's not forget that as the oil supply shock goes away, as oil does finally get out of the Strait of Hormuz, we're basically replacing a negative supply shock with a positive demand shock. And again, Econ 101 tells us, just as negative supply shock is going to put upward pressure on prices, so now a positive demand shock also puts upward pressure on prices. The difference being that you can spread that demand shock out over a longer period of time. So what is this demand shock? We have depleted oil reserves, not just here in the United States, but around the world, at literally the fastest rate on record, because never before have we seen such a large supply chain disruption. So this means that now all of these nations, again, not just the United States, are now going to have to refill those reserves, which means you are not only going to have the normal level of oil demand, but now you have a level of demand on top of that, which is, again, the replenishing of these reserves. So that tells us that there will be some artificial, I don't want to say artificial, it's probably not the best word for it, but there will be some additional upward pressure on prices for a while until those reserves get refilled. And then after that, we can expect prices to return to what you might consider to be the new equilibrium, right? But again, we've had disruptions with fertilizer. We've had disruptions with sulfuric acid, with helium. We've had disruptions with all kinds of chemical precursors for the plastics industry. I mean, think about how many things in your life contain plastics. And not to mention that whether it's cosmetics, whether it's pharmaceuticals, I mean, the list just goes on and on. All the different consumer products that are going to be impacted in the months to come. And all that, David, is just baked into the cake at this point. There are higher food prices in coming months, again, that are baked into the cake because of what happened to fertilizer prices. So this stuff is going to take a while to work its way through supply chains. You may have prices at the pump come back down and even reach pre-war levels and stay there for a very long time. But I don't want folks to underestimate just how much you're going to see the impact of this supply chain disruption, again, rear its ugly head you'll see these weird spikes in all kinds of consumer prices,
Yeah.
whether it's food, you name it. It is coming, and we are going to have to deal with that in the months and maybe in the year to come.
This is an excellent point you brought up. The cause of inflation could be from a supply shock or a demand shock. COVID was a supply shock issue, and then later a demand shock, but initially a supply shock issue. And the Fed lowered rates and accommodated that supply shock by loosening monetary policy and instituting quantitative easing. Now we also have a supply shock, but people are talking about raising interest rates to combat inflation from a supply shock. Is that the correct policy here, EJ?
No, and history has told us, David, that it's not the case. We had the Fed make exactly that mistake in the past. You can go back several decades when we had an oil shock in the 70s. And how did the Fed respond? They tried to fight those rising prices by raising interest rates. And all it did was simply compound the problem, because you can't take a monetary tool and try to fix a non-monetary problem. If you need a screwdriver, don't go reaching for a hammer. All you're going to do is break something else, right? Well, that's exactly what the Fed did. And fortunately, I think Warsh realizes that, and he's going to have to, as painful as it may be in the near term, look past the current supply shock and the current price increases. As the saying goes, the Fed needs to look past it, because the issue there is not monetary, fundamentally speaking.
Okay, let's talk about the effects that big tech have played on our society. Now, we have here Congresswoman AOC calling for big tech to be broken up. Here's a quote from her interview with Fox News. Take a listen. She said, "The problem that we have is that these big companies, they think they are governments. They want to be governments. We need to break up a lot of these companies that are far, far too big, and we also need to be instituting consumer protections for people." Now, you'll recall that the state of New York has implemented a moratorium on data center building in New York. So here's a quote from Bernie Sanders. He said, "A moratorium will give us time to understand the risks, time to protect working families, time to defend our democracy, and time to ensure that this technology works for all of us, not just a few." Sanders has also previously called for the government to own 50% of AI companies. So the government has already taken steps to guardrail AI companies in the form of a moratorium on data center building in New York. Now they're thinking about breaking up big tech companies. Your response to what I just read for you?
Well, like many of the sound bites that come out of people like AOC, they're just not very sound. I mean, look, they are lovely talking points. Don't get me wrong; they're very attractive. It sounds nice. We want to do things like protect consumers. Okay, that sounds great. How would anyone object to protecting consumers? But when we talk about things like we need to break up the big tech companies, why? These people will identify what they perceive to be problems, such as rising prices for certain technology products, and then immediately jump to the conclusion that that is coming about simply because certain companies are large, and that would not happen but for the fact that those companies are large. In other words, breaking up these companies will somehow result in lower prices, even though that would obviously destroy economies of scale. Look, the fact of the matter is, these new technologies that we are seeing coming online with things like AI have surged the demand for things like memory, and that is driving up costs. By the way, anybody who's been watching the producer price index could have seen this coming, and should have, for literally months right now, because the component of the producer price index, the PPI, the specific component that includes things like computer chips, memory, that has been going parabolic again for several months now. And so anyone who has familiarity with the supply chains in the technology sector knew that these price hikes for things like laptops was coming and has arrived and is probably going to continue. But this has nothing to do with the size of the companies. This is, again, due entirely to the fact that there has been a massive and really unprecedented increase in the demand for those computer chips. So the answer then is not break up the companies who have economies of scale and can actually get these chips at lower prices and pass those savings on to consumers because they're placing such massive orders, they get the best pricing from the chip factories. The answer instead is to simply produce more chips, right? increase supply. When you increase supply, this is Econ 101, you drive down prices. So we need to produce more chips, not break up the companies buying the chips. Again, once you kind of put it in its proper framework, you realize these proposals from folks like AOC make zero sense.
Let's talk about the labor market. I referenced your stance on AI in the introduction. Now, the unemployment rate hasn't ticked up dramatically in the last print. We're still right above 4%. And like I mentioned in the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index reading, people aren't so much concerned about losing their jobs to AI yet. People are mostly focused on rising prices due to higher oil prices. Now, will we lose our jobs to AI? Should this start to become a concern? And if so, how do we prepare for that?
Well, I think it's important to remember nobody loses their job to a new technology. You lose your job to somebody else who knows how to use that technology. So the best defense here, I think, is a good offense, right? When factory workers went from using hand tools to using power tools, yeah, a lot of factory workers got laid off, but they got laid off because somebody who could use the power tools could do their work. So be that person, I guess, is my advice to folks. If I can give some unsolicited advice here, learn how to use AI, learn how to be as productive as possible, learn to be the most valuable worker in your workspace. And that's your job insurance as much as you can have any. But here's the other thing, David, that's really important to remember. All of these disruptive technologies, whether it was power tools in factories, whether it was automobiles on the road, whether it was the steam engine and then the diesel electric, you name it, whether it's the internet, all these different technologies always end up creating more jobs than they destroy. Now, what are those jobs going to be? I don't know. If I knew, I would be a billionaire, right? But before the smartphone, how many people were app developers? How many people were driving for Uber before rideshare technologies existed, or Lyft, or any of those other ones? So the answer here is that you don't know what kinds of jobs are going to be created. But the reason you do know jobs are going to be created, and this gives us an opportunity to blow up another Keynesian fallacy, is there's no such thing as aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is infinite. Every single one of us individually has unlimited wants and needs. Well, what happens if you put a very large group, say 330 million people, with unlimited and wants and needs together? Guess what? In aggregate, you still have unlimited wants and needs. So the point here is that even though a technology may make certain things cheaper, and now you don't spend as much of your budget on that, and now you have more money to spend on other things, that simply means your demand for other things is going to go up. And again, maybe those are things that haven't even been invented yet. But the point is, you are still just going to spend your money on other things. And that creates demand in other sectors of the economy, which puts upward pressure on employment in those sectors. And so once more, yes, some jobs get eliminated by AI, but more jobs get created in other spaces. And that's really important to remember, because I think it helps dispel a lot of the fear, really, that has been ginned up around this new technology.
I know it's difficult to speculate as to what new jobs can be created from a new technology. A lot of new jobs are created from old jobs being wiped out. Now, if you had to speculate as to what could be a popular new profession from the advent of AI, which is going to eliminate a lot of the need for middle office jobs in coding, what could that be, EJ?
I think there's going to be a much bigger demand for people who work with their hands. And again, the reason for that goes back to, you're going to spend so much less money on other things, maybe on basic legal services. You can just have AI do a lot of that work for you. So you spend so much less money on that you have more money maybe to do a home renovation project. Well, guess what? AI is not going to do your plumbing or run your electrical for you. AI is not going to be the mason that puts a new brick or stone facade on your home, right? So it may very well increase demand for occupations in the trades. But the other thing, and this is maybe where we're getting really into the realm of speculation here, David, but when I watch how good AI has become at these like deepfake videos, right? AI has become so good at things like making videos. I begin to wonder, are we approaching a point? And again, this is pure speculation on my part. Are we approaching a point where it will become so easy to fake video and audio, that those types of things, anything digital perhaps, will no longer be admissible in court? Are we going to get to a place where if you have surveillance video of someone robbing your convenience store, a judge and jury can't look at that because it's just too easy to fake it? And so might you see a resurgence of some of these old school professions of things like security guards that have largely gone by the wayside? Obviously, there are still plenty of security guards, but there's far less of a demand now because of things like cameras. Might you see a resurgence in those types of occupations because so much of these technologies on which we've come to rely, again, might literally become inadmissible in court? Now, that's total speculation on my part. You may have technologies develop even faster that are aimed at detecting deepfakes, whether or not a video is real or not. I don't know, outside my area of expertise, but just something to ruminate on.
What about the military? Have you thought about what the military in 50 years is going to look like, and whether or not we still need manpower as an indicator of military strength?
I think so, but and again, this goes back to, you don't get replaced by AI, you get replaced by somebody using AI.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, and this is something that Victor Davis Hanson addressed in his book, The Second World Wars. When we talk about things like the war in the air or the war at sea, why were those things important? They weren't important from the standpoint of they directly affected people. Just because you have air supremacy, that doesn't actually mean you automatically win the war, because we don't have wings. Nobody lives in the air, right? If you want to affect the outcome of the war, you have to affect people and where people live, which is on the ground. So what things like the air war and the naval war did is they allowed people to then impact the ground war. And so that is what I have to imagine these new battlefields of the future are going to do as well. And so again, it's not necessarily just a matter of there's no longer a human element in war, but perhaps that human element changes a bit. And so perhaps you don't have as much human pilots in the cockpit. Perhaps it is more so a human piloting a drone remotely. But I don't think you're ever ultimately going to completely get away from that human component.
Thanks very much, EJ. We appreciate your time. Where can we follow your work?
Best place to find me is going to be on the X platform, and the handle there is @real.E.J.
All right, we'll put the link down there, so please do follow EJ on X and social media. Thanks again. We'll speak to you again soon. Take care for now.
You too, David. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe.